Okay, hello class. This is Dr. Lyons again. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the intertidal zone, as in the areas that occur between the tides, between high tide and low tide. And this is what an intertidal zone looks like throughout a lot of the west coast of the US. So Washington, Oregon, California. So the intertidal zone is the area that is between where the hot water is the highest at high tide and where it's the lowest at low tide. So it's that area that is sometimes covered by water and sometimes is out in the air. So a really important question that I first want to talk about is, are all the organisms in the intertidal zone, are they all exposed to air for the same duration of time? So for instance, like this anemone down here, is it exposed to air as often as these barnacles up here? So the answer to that question is no. So this anemone is going to be covered by water more often than these barnacles. Essentially, the higher up you are in the intertidal zone, the more often you spend outside of the water. The further down you go, the more time you spend in the water. And if you're completely below that, then you're now in what's known as the subtidal zone, where you're always covered up by water. You're never out in the air. So are these barnacles exposed more often than these mussels? Yes, these barnacles are in fact going to be exposed more often than mussels. And that's in general what you find in a lot of intertidal zones, that things like barnacles and limpets, they tend to be pretty high up in the intertidal zone, where things more like mussels and a lot of types of seaweeds will be found lower in the intertidal zone. So let's take a look at a tide chart and try to figure out when would be the best time to see intertidal organisms. So this is something that I do when I want to go look at intertidal organisms. I'll look at a tide chart and figure out when's going to be the best time. So the best time is going to be when the tide is the lowest, because that means the water is going to be as low as possible, meaning that you can explore more of the intertidal zone without having to go swimming. And how you can tell that from here is looking for negative numbers. So this is showing us, days on the side. And these are the high tides, so the morning high tide and the afternoon high tide when they occur. And that's showing you how high the water is in feet above mean low tide. So mean low tide will be at 0 feet. So what the average low tide, like not a spring tide, not a neap tide right in the middle, the average would be 0 feet. So any negative numbers that you see in feet are when the tide is lower than normal, that meaning that there's a spring low tide. So what you want to look for is negative numbers in feet. And the more negative it is, the lower it is, the lower that the water is going to be. So for this particular month, I can't remember which month this was that I got this tide chart for, but for this particular month, the absolute best time to go, let's see, would be this time right here. So there's a negative 0.4 feet low tide at this particular time. And this would be at 1:33 p.m. And that would be on Thursday the 6th. So that isn't for this particular month. This is just a tide chart I grabbed just offline a year or two ago. So you'd have to actually look at a tide chart for this month to see when is the best time to go and look at intertidal organisms. So the key thing, remember, is that the more negative the number is, the better, the more intertidal things you'll be able to see. So let's talk about some of these things that you can see in the intertidal. So there are organisms that are known as epifauna. So epi means outside, like epidermis is the outer layer of our skin. And fauna means animals. So flora means plants, fauna means animals. So these are things that live on the outside of substrates. So for instance, these mud snails, they're epifauna. These barnacles, they're epifauna because they're actually on the surface of the sea floor. In fauna, those are things that live actually within the substrate, so they're dug in. So for instance, this clam would be dug into the sand, right? It's got its little siphon that it uses for breathing and feeding. So that would be the surface of the seafloor. And then the clam itself is buried within. So that would be infauna. They live in the sand, in the substrate. And then megafauna, these are things that are tiny. So they're so tiny that to them, a grain of sand is huge. So for them, a grain of sand is like the size of a house to us. And so they're so small that they can fit between the small spaces between grains of sand. So they live in those tiny spaces, in those cracks and crevices between the grains of sand. So like this thing here, this is what's known as a copepod. So this is a type of crustacean, so a type of arthropod, and it is meiofauna. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about challenges of the intertidal zone. That's what we're going to cover for the rest of this part of chapter 11. So I've broken chapter 11 into abiotic challenges and then biotic challenges. So for the rest of this part of chapter 11, we'll be talking about things that in the intertidal zone that are challenging, that cause challenges not from living things. And then in the next part, we'll talk about how living things make it challenging for other living things. So probably the most severe challenge, abiotic challenge, that is desiccation. And so this is water loss. So remember, the things we're talking about that live in intertidal zone, those things tend to be marine animals, or at least they are more marine-like than they are land-like. So for them, being out in the air when the tide is really low is challenging because they can lose their water. So you might remember from one of the SpongeBob movies when poor Patrick and SpongeBob end up on the table out in the air and they start to dry out. That's what happens to intertidal organisms. If they can't get into the water for a prolonged period of time, they dry out and then they die. So of course this is worse when it's hot and dry, like summer times in Los Angeles, for instance. And there's a lot of adaptations that animals and plants in the intertidal zone have for dealing with this. So anything that can move around can just go to the shade or can go into a tide pool. So you see a sea star that is hiding inside of this tide pool, waiting for the high tide to come back. There's a lot of things that have shells that will clam up, meaning that they will close up those shells in order to conserve moisture that they have inside of them. So here's a snail. It has this little bony plate here called an operculum, and it closes that operculum in order to conserve water inside of it. If you think about any sort of bivalve, like a mussel or a clam, it can close up the two shells of the two parts of its shell in order to conserve water inside. And then there's some things that are just really tolerant of being severely dehydrated. So rockweeds, like these things that you see here, so these are what are known as fucus rockweeds, and they can lose as much as 90% of their water, right? So 90% of their water is gone, and they can still survive from that. They can still be rehydrated, which is pretty remarkable. You know, for us humans, we can lose, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20% of our water and still recover, but these things can lose a lot of their water and still come back. Okay, a kind of related challenge to desiccation is temperature, because if you're out in the hot sun, it's a lot hotter than being in the water. So the kind of key thing here is that air temperatures vary a heck of a lot more than ocean temperatures do, right? So on a daily basis, the ocean temperature stays pretty much the same. It might vary just a little bit, but it doesn't vary a lot. Whereas air temperatures obviously, change a lot. It might be quite cold in the morning and then pretty hot by noon. So if a organism is living in the intertidal zone, then it deals with those wide-ranging temperatures from cold in the morning till hot at night, or hot in the afternoon, I should say. So some of the adaptations that animals and plants have for dealing with this in their intertidal zone is, first of all, some are just incredibly tolerant. So there are some snails who can withstand their internal temperature getting to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty crazy. We couldn't do that. If your internal temperature got to that point, you'd be so dead. You would be beyond dead. whereas these snails, they can deal with it quite well. Of course, things that can move around, they can just move into cooler areas, so move into tide pools or move into the shade. Being light in color helps, right? So we have this light colored snail. The lighter an object is, the less heat it absorbs from the sun. Okay, so then kind of a third problem that kind of comes with this is kind of related to desiccation. Is that when you are out in the air, if you are a marine organism, now you find it very challenging in order to feed and in order to breathe. Because for a lot of marine organisms, they can only feed and breathe when they're covered up by water. So for instance, something like a mussel or a clam, when those things clam up and they close their two shells, they can't feed anymore. Because remember, those things are filter feeders, so they need to suck water into themselves, remove all the small particles from that water, and then spit out the water that they've cleaned the food out of. So if they're closed up and they're not sucking water in, they're not feeding. They're also not breathing because they need to suck in water in order to pass water over their gills and get oxygen from that water. So they're not breathing either. So when things clam up, they can't feed and they can't breathe. So like I was saying, filter feeders or suspension feeders, they can't feed in the air. They have no way of doing that. So how do things deal with this? Right, so what a lot of things do is they just tolerate having a very slow metabolism, right? So they don't feed very often, they don't breathe very often, and as a consequence, they just don't grow very quickly. So there are a lot of things there that just deal with this. In fact, there's a lot of animals that can go for very, very long periods of time without feeding just because they have such a slow metabolism. Particularly things that live in the deep ocean, for instance, like deep ocean sharks, for instance, they can go for months on end without actually having to feed. And so it's the same with things that live in the intertidal zone. There is a lot of things that when they are submerged by water, they will just eat as much as they possibly can. It's a sort of like bonanza type situation. When there's water around them, they go on this sort of feeding bonanza. And then when there is no water around them, then they just kind of hunker down, just kind of and don't do anything. A lot of these things, they don't use much oxygen, so they're very, very efficient with their oxygen. They've got slow metabolisms, and that means they don't need much oxygen, which deals with the no breathing problem. And finally, there are some intertidal organisms or marine organisms in general that can actually breathe air. So crabs are really the benchmark for this. So there are many species of crabs who on their legs, they have these little pads, and those pads are kind of like lungs. So they can actually absorb oxygen from the air through those pads in their legs, and they can get carbon dioxide out of their bodies through those little pads. So that's why there are a lot of different species of land crabs that actually go for very, very long periods of time without being submerged by water. They do, in fact, have to return to water every now and then. They have to return to water in order to reproduce. But other than that, land crabs will spend the rest of their time just out in the air, walking around on dry land. So there are some marine organisms that have evolved the ability to breathe in air, although not many of them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about waves. Because in an intertidal zone, you are right in the full force of waves. So waves, first a little bit of a refresher on what controls waves. So first of all, where waves originate from, that has a big effect on the strength of waves. So the faster the wind is blowing, the longer the duration that the wind blows, in the wider, the more geographic area that a storm takes up, that will affect the strength of the waves. But then as waves come into a shoreline, they're very much affected by the shoreline. So for instance, any areas that are enclosed tend to have much weaker waves, whereas areas that are exposed and waves that in areas that stick out onto points, they tend to get a lot more force of those waves as waves crash to shore. So for instance, in this diagram here, if you were here, here, or here, you would see pretty big waves. If you were here or here, you'd see much smaller waves, right? So here and here, those are points that are sticking out, so there's going to be much bigger waves there. Here and here, that's a lot more enclosed, so less big waves. And this is a canyon, and we'll talk in a minute about why it is that canyons get really big waves. So essentially what happens is as waves go over shallow water, they lose their strength. So for instance, if you're in here, the waves have to travel over all this shallow water in order to get to you. So they lose a lot of their strength as they're coming in. Whereas this point right here sticks out further, so the waves don't have to go over as long a distance of shallow water to get to that point. So they come in with a lot more force. I think nowhere embodies this point better than what's known as Steamer Lane up in Santa Cruz. Right, so Santa Cruz is on the northern tip of Monterey Bay in central California, and Steamer Lane is a really famous surfing spot in California. So out here, there's this lighthouse out here, and then along this whole stretch here, there's surfing along here. So there's an underwater point that sticks out here beyond this land point here. So because there's this point sticking out, that's where the waves tend to be the strongest. So on any given day, the waves might look like that there. They might be, 10 or 20 feet tall because they can be quite big. But then way up in here, this area is what's known as Cowles Beach. And in that area, you will see much smaller waves. And you'll see more like beginners surfing there, because that's with those smaller waves, it's a much better place for those beginners to hang out. Whereas out here, much bigger waves. Me personally, I'm more of a fan of this middle area here, right? So not too big waves, but not tiny waves. So as these waves come in along here, right, so they'll be really big right here at the point, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally they get into here where they're really small. So these waves kind of refract, they bend around this point, and that bending action kind of slows the waves down and makes them weaker by the time they get up there. Okay, probably one of the most famous canyon surfing points is what's known as Nizar Canyon in Portugal. So Portugal, in Europe, so there's a very tiny map of Europe. Portugal kind of sticks out off of, like this is Spain here, and Portugal kind of sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. In this area of Portugal, known as Praia do Norte, has this underwater canyon leading up to it. And so when waves come in over this underwater canyon, they're coming into shore over this very, very deep water, meaning that they're not coming in over shallow water, which slows down those waves. So when waves are coming in, they don't lose any of their power, and then they crash to shoreline with huge amounts of force. Right. So this picture that you see here, that tiny little spot, that is a full-grown human. And that human is riding a wave which is something like 60 or 70 feet tall. So really big waves hit the shoreline in Praia do Norte. Okay, so obviously waves have a big effect on surfing, but they also have a big effect on animals that are in the rocky intertidal zone and plants in the intertidal zone. And the issue for these animals and plants is becoming dislodged, so waves, yanking them off the rocks, or waves causing them to break. So how do these animals and plants deal with this issue? Right, so how a lot of them deal with it is they have really strong adherence. So they're really glued down to the seafloor really well. So for instance, mussels have these incredibly strong threads known as Bissells threads, which hold them onto the seafloor. There are barnacles. They have this really incredible glue that sticks them onto the seafloor. Seaweeds have holdfast, which we learned about back in, I guess that was chapter 6. We learned about the holdfast, which is kind of like the root of a seaweed. So these things all hold them onto the seafloor. So they can use those to hold on. There you can see these are the Bissells threads of a mussel. So those tiny little threads, even though they're quite small, they're incredibly strong. These threads are stronger than most man-made materials. And then here's the hold fast of a seaweed holding it to the seafloor. What a lot of things will do in intertidal zones is they'll just hide. So when there are big waves crashing all around them, they just hide under things, so as to get out of the full force of the waves. A lot of things in intertidal zones will be flexible. So for instance, this is what's known as a palm kelp. And if this kelp was really rigid, then when waves pass by it, it might cause them to break. Whereas because they're flexible like this, they can kind of bend in the waves, and that water can rush by without causing them to break. So being flexible is really useful. A lot of things have strong shells, right? So things like clams and barnacles and mussels, they have these strong shells. So if a rock gets turned over on them by wave, it might prevent them from getting crushed. A lot of things in the intertidal will have a very low profile, right? So the lower your profile, the less drag you have, right? By hunkering down, kind of like this anemone, water passes over you. Whereas if you're extended, then water, is running into you and causing more drag and making it more likely that you will get pulled off the rocks. So things like anemones, when there's big waves, they'll kind of be more flat, and when there's less big waves, they'll kind of stand more upright like that. What a lot of things will do in order to deal with waves is by having friends, right? So if you have some friends around you, that makes less drag. So imagine, for instance, you're just a poor solitary mussel. If you're a poor solitary mussel, then waves, when they crash and they cause water to go swirling around, that water can kind of get underneath you and pull you up off the rocks. Whereas if you're surrounded by buddies, then that water is more likely to pass over the top of you rather than getting underneath you and yanking you off the rocks. However, if you've got too many friends, if you've got a whole big party of friends, then that's bad. Because if you have mussels and then on top of them are more mussels and then on top of them are more mussels, now you have quite a lot of drag. And if you have too many mussels that aren't attached to the actual sea floor, then they can get yanked off of the rocks. Okay, finally, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of wave action is a little bit about how reproduction can be affected by wave action. So this is a barnacle, and you might remember that I taught you something kind of interesting about barnacles. I taught you that barnacles have the largest penis of anything in the animal kingdom, right? So here's the body of a barnacle, and this is its penis. Right, so barnacles have incredibly long penises compared to their body length. So let's think about that. If there's waves crashing around a barnacle and it's trying to extend its penis out to find a neighbor and to inseminate its neighbor, could those waves be a problem? And the answer is absolutely yes. So when barnacles are trying to extend their penis out and they're trying to find a neighbor to stick their penis into to have sex with, waves can cause a big issue for that. Because waves will kind of move the penis around, making it harder for it to find its neighbor. Or, worst case scenario, a wave can cause the penis to get broken off, and then it's not going to be able to reproduce at all. So barnacles, their reproduction faces serious challenges when there are waves around them. So let's talk about how they do. So barnacles actually can make some decisions based on this. So when a barnacle is growing its penis, it can decide whether it wants to have a long, thin penis or if it wants to have a short, stout penis, which I know is hilarious, but that's just what they do. So if a barnacle is in a place that's really wavy, right? If there's a lot of big waves around, the barnacle will say, I'm in a place where a short, stout penis is the way to go, because I don't want my penis to get broken off by a big, wave that runs into me. So what you find is barnacles that are in areas with big waves will have short, stout penises, which are less likely to break off. Whereas if a barnacle is in an area that is really calm without a lot of waves, they'll say, you know what? I don't need to worry about waves. So instead, I'm going to have a long, thin penis, which is able to reach more of my neighbors, right? Because remember, the more neighbors you can reach with your penis, the more neighbors you can have sex with, which is better. So those barnacles that live in areas where there's not a lot of waves, they will grow long, thin penises so that they can have sex with more of their neighbors. Whereas if you're a barnacle in an area where there's really big waves, you want to have a short, stout penis that doesn't get broken off by waves. So barnacles have a really important decision to make, right? So they can decide, what style of penis to have, which is, just another reason why these funny little barnacles are such, incredible animals. They're things that we don't really think about because they're these tiny little things that just live in the intertidal zone, but they're actually pretty fascinating. Some of the stuff that they can do with their reproduction. Okay, so that's all I have to tell you about abiotic challenges to animals and plants in the intertidal zone. In the next chapter, we're going to talk more about the biotic challenges that they face.